Welcome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's great to see all of you saying hello in the chat from all over the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're saying hi from. We are happy to welcome you to today's NEASC Forum, Listening and Leading, Using Surveys to Guide Impactful Learning in Schools. We have participants today from over 55 countries, over 400 registrants. So we are so glad to see you all here from everywhere from Istanbul to Rhode Island, I see. So my name is Trillium Hiblin. I'm the Associate Director for NEASC's International Wing, which is the Commission on International Education, based out of Krakow, Poland. And I'm joined today by two special guests, Julia Higdon and Tim Carr, both from Avenues, the World School. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Thanks so much for having us. My name is Julia Higdon. I'm the Global Director of Research, Analytics, and Measurement at Avenues. And prior to coming to Avenues, I was a school teacher in grades 3 through 6. And then I went into statistics and research and came to Avenues to direct their research program. And I'll pass it off to Tim.
Thanks, Julia. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone all around the world. It's great to see the global community coming together for this moment. And we're delighted to be with you. I'm tuning in from Western Massachusetts, the other side of the state from Julia. And this is where I've landed after 25 years overseas, where I was working in a number of international schools in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And for 20 of those years, I was a head of school. I've landed back in the US in this beautiful spot, and I work for Avenues. I'm a senior advisor with them now, which means a couple of things. It means that I'm old, and it also means that I get to do a lot of fun projects for Avenues with all of our campuses. We've got campuses in New York and Sao Paulo, Shenzhen, online, and in Silicon Valley, California. And so it's a really vibrant ecosystem of schools, and it's just been a delight to work with them, in part because I get to work with the likes of Julia, who's going to be the main star of our show here today. And she is just one of a kind in my experience with research, data analysis, and general insight on learning. These people are rare in the planet, and she is, in my mind, one of the leaders of this whole domain. And so it's been such a joy. And she's a great person too. So looking forward to this moment where we're going to share a few ideas with you about surveys and their usage in schools. And I will be sort of adding a little bit of color commentary on the side. Julia's going to be giving you sort of the lowdown on the best uses of this potentially very powerful tool. So we're going to dive right in. Julia, I think if you could
Tim,
can
I interrupt for just 1 second?
Please go right ahead.
Thanks. Just mention that we have a very active chat, but we also have a Q&A section at the bottom, which is a great place to populate questions that you would like answered during the Q&A toward the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the session. I'm going to go offline while you all have your conversation. I'll come back for Q&A in a little bit.
Thanks, Trillium. Really appreciate you monitoring that. We'll try to keep an eye on the chat and on the Q&A strand as well. But we're going to count on you to help us with that along the way. So thanks for your assistance. So we entitled this one "Listening and Leading," and using surveys in an impactful manner, something that is sort of near and dear to our hearts. It's very difficult to do this well, and I think that you're going to hear from Julia some really helpful techniques as to how to do that. But wanted to set it up today to talk a little bit about our approach to surveys and this particular sort of listening and leading that we're going to expand upon today. Julie, if you could go to the next slide, that would be helpful, and we'll talk a little bit about our approach. The purpose of surveys, it's a wielded as a tool in many organizations and schools in particular. It's something that we use in the NEASC accreditation process. And I actually serve on the NEASC commission as well. And on the receiving end of a lot of survey data, when schools are submitting their reports in the midst of the accreditation process. And this is a vital way to collect information about your school and about ways in which you can lead it forward. But the purpose really of surveys is to support decision making with actual evidence. And this is not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to construct or to lead, and to make proper usage of that valuable data once you have it. And actually what we're going to expand upon a little bit is when you've done that listening and gathered that evidence, it requires actually courageousness. It requires you to be brave. It requires also for you to be humble and open to what might be learned when you're asking those questions. So ultimately, what we're trying to do as school leaders is to influence a culture in the school that's going to be conducive to learning. And if that's an evidence-infused culture, then that's one that's going to be optimal for all parties concerned. So easier said than done, and I'm going to dish it over to Julia, and she'll give you a little bit of guidance as to how we go about it at Avenues and what some of the tips of the trade might be. Julia, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. When it comes to your surveys, among all of the research methods that are out there, it's the one that we gravitate toward the most. And I think there are good reasons for that. It's well suited when you're interested in the perceptions or preferences of a large group. So it's a very efficient way to collect those data, analyze them, and report back when you're interested in perceptions and preferences. It's a good tool for the job if you can express this research interest with simple rating questions or a number of simple rating questions. And so this isn't a topic that's so complex that it requires a conversation. It can be expressed in a straightforward way using your typical rating and open-ended questions. And so it's bound in that way to things that are fairly easy to express simply. And then thirdly, it's a good tool to use if participation is likely. And we could talk a bit more if you're interested in participation rates and how to increase that. But it's not a good tool if you don't anticipate that participation coming in and you don't have a process in place to ensure it. For example, having everybody complete it at a specific time, expressing your expectations around participation and following up with folks. There are other research methods out there. If you don't feel that the questions that you're interested in answering are expressible simply, then you might consider an interview or a focus group. If there's a reason why you might suspect that participation might not happen, consider random sampling and one-on-one interviews to get underneath why the participation might not happen and to get more one-on-one time with people. So there are plenty of other research methods out there. Surveys are they're very efficient. You can get into your entire population with a survey. You can collect the data fairly quickly and you have a way to analyze them later. So it's a good choice, but it's not the only choice. What are data protections? That is a very big topic. I'll touch on it quickly here, and I'll touch on it a little bit throughout the next few slides. The GDPR is now about 4 years old, and I might surprise you by saying that I love this legislation. I love these regulations. I think that it is tremendously helpful, whether you are collecting data among EU citizens or not. I think it's tremendously helpful to understand those regulations and to work hard to implement them at your organization. I think that it builds trust in your communities when they see you adhering to these standards. And it gives your organization a moment to actually explore all of the different ways that data touches our lives and understand that you are really dealing with data protections from beginning of research design through to data collection and informed consent and on to your data storage. And so I did want to talk a little bit about it. And then you would also need to get expert advice when you design your own data collection systems.
I would just interject here, Julia, that one of our jobs as school leaders is to help people to feel safe and to create a trusting environment in our schools. So this is a way that we can help ensure that that's true, is to uphold some of these protections as well. And in so doing, as Julia said, we're going to get better quality data out of it.
Julia, maybe just for people in our audience who don't know what GDPR is, could you just say a little bit more about what those regulations are? Because some people in other parts of the world may not have heard of it.
Well, yes, absolutely. So the GDPR, the General Data Protection Act was put in place in 2018 in the EU, and it covers a lot. There are three main areas that I would like to talk about. It's a way to walk through all the ways that data impact our lives from start to finish in an organized way. The first part of the GDPR has to do with setting a clear purpose for the collection of data. So you should be able to articulate your intent, the problem you're trying to solve with the data collection. And when you collect the data you collect should only be relevant to that purpose. So for example, if you're interested in student academic stress, you might also collect some data around their background, but you would only limit it to the data that you would need to answer that particular question. And so when we get into survey design, I'll show you how we do that at Avenues using our research brief. But the clear purpose is where it all starts. And you should be able to clearly link your data collection to that purpose and your interests in serving your families and colleagues. The second sort of pillar of this has to do with the rights and freedoms of the individuals from whom you're collecting their data. And so informed consent is a big part of that. And I think that's what we think about the most when we think about rights and freedoms. So that means that you are expressing your intentions behind the data collection, their usage, and you're letting folks know how you are protecting their privacy. And then you're giving the options to opt in or out. To people, it should be as easy to opt out as it is to opt in. But this is generally dealing with the set of rights that individuals have. They have the right to be informed. They have the right to access their data. They have the right to correct data, to erase data. They have the right to restrict your processing of data, the way data moves. They have the right to how the data portability is working. They have the right to object to this data collection, and they have the right to not be subject to automated decision making on the basis of these data. So your individuals that you're collecting data from have a set of rights, and you need to balance your purpose and your needs against their rights and freedoms and make sure those are coexisting. The third section of the GDPR has to do with secure processing. How are you housing your data? Are your are the folks in your data, are they identified by name or anything like a picture? Or are they identifiable through IDs or any kind of matching? So you need to understand the identification of your data, where it's securely stored, how you're securely processing it. And that has to do with generally a tech team as well, and making sure you're coordinating with them. And then back to the individual rights and freedoms, if you do have a data breach, there are time limits for how long that you need to be notifying people, how long you have to notify people, and what those processes ought to look like. It's a big, thick piece of legislation, but my best advice is don't panic. Take a look at it, think about these three main pillars. And if you are collecting data, you know, in the EU or any EU citizens, you would want to get expert advice as well. But when you do these things and people see you doing these things, to Tim's point, it raises the trust. It also raises the bar on your skills as an organization around research, working with the individuals in your population and keeping things secure. We can come back to this if you have questions later. So to that first part, having clear purposes, we have at Avenues set up what we call the research brief, and I could not recommend it enough to this group of people, is having something that documents what you're trying to accomplish with your research and with that specific, say, survey or other data collection. So after the session, you'll receive these as handouts, so you don't have to frantically write this down, but I am going to show you what that looks like here at Avenues. So this is meant to be a one-page document. We can do 2 pages if necessary, but ideally it's on 1 page. And it sets up the scope of your research project. It specifies the problem you're trying to solve. How did this problem come to be? And then it articulates in a clear way an answerable research question. The actions are important because it lets us know what are people going to do with these data, because especially in schools, we have a lot of intelligent, very curious colleagues. They'll generate interesting questions, but if it's not linked to a specific action, it might not be a valuable use of your research time. So you'll think about the actions and what the reporting should look like, who receives it, general broad sweeps about the methods you're going to use, the questions that you would ask, start date and deadline, whether informed consent is necessary, so you should have somebody that you're consulting with on that, and then the roles. We just find this so helpful when we're going through the research process and we're designing the questions later. We come back to this. Would this question answer this survey question answer this research question? Will this reporting answer this particular research question? At the end of the day, have we been successful against this brief? It also allows the decision makers in your organization to be able to see exactly what you're doing, and there's no confusion about that. It's established, and folks are in agreement with that, or they're giving you feedback and you're iterating until you get leadership agreement and approval. So it's just a great tool. It's meant to be short and not too long, and to hit all of the main points.
It also lends itself to thoughtfulness about the design as well. You know, as a leader, often survey is kind of a knee-jerk reaction, something that I've been guilty of as well. And this helps you to sort of think carefully about why it is you're doing what you're doing, and then how it is you are going to accomplish it, and whether you actually have the capacity to do all those things well in that moment. So very helpful sort of tool to think through the process before you leap.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tim. And it's always helpful to me when leaders like yourself will use that then in your language when you're talking to people about survey participation and notes home. You know, here's why we're doing this. This is what why we think it's important. So whenever you do that, it's always so supportive for me. Okay, so I'm going to get into some of the actual survey design. Keep it short. We've all fallen in the trap of the kitchen sink surveys where everybody's curiosities are on the table. We try to keep it minimized to up to 12 rating questions and 3 open-ended response opportunities, ideally 1 or 2 open-ended response opportunities, but we try to cap it at 3. That doesn't mean that there won't be moments where you do have to take a step back and take a very large retrospective across a lot of aspects of your school, but that shouldn't be the general practice. The general practice should be short, focused surveys that are given at specific times during the year. You might also consider a pulse. We've had a lot of success with a pulse, which is where you're sending out one rating question, one open end, and it's about a very specific topic. And we get a lot of quick participation in those, and they're a lot quicker to turn around in the reporting. So we've had a lot of success with the pulse, and we've been using that for about 4 or 5 years now. Keep it focused. Try not to, I said before, try to avoid the kitchen sink. Keep it as focused as you can, because that way, when you're working with your individuals who are going to receive the survey and understanding their rights and freedoms, you should be able to describe in the invitation to the survey what it's about and what it's going to be used for. And so if you've got a focused theme of the survey, it just makes it all come together a lot more clearly for the people that you're collecting data from. It should be neutral. There shouldn't be any wrong answer except for an untruthful answer to the survey. It should be inclusive. There are some research strategies that maybe grab a random sample, like an interview or a focus group. I don't recommend those for a survey. I recommend that you survey everybody in your population so that everybody has the opportunity to be included. And it should be multilingual. So you should translate it into the target languages of your recipients, because when you're asking for perceptions, it's generally an emotional place for people, and they tend to feel more comfortable in their first or preferred language. And so it's really important to make sure you take the time to translate it into the known languages that your target population speaks.
That may be a little tricky in some of the international schools that have, 50 to 70 nationalities and even more languages. But, if you can pick out sort of the largest incidence ones, or ways that you can bridge language divides in your school, there's lots of ways in which you have to do that in messaging for various other reasons. So just think about how you can succinctly do that with survey design.
Yeah, that's a great point. We do hit some of so we collect the data of, the home languages of our families. But to your point, Tim, you couldn't have yourself write 50 different translations. And so providing the opportunity for somebody to translate and walk through the survey for folks and to ask for that, it would be a great way to balance that. Okay, so we're going to get into the best survey questions. The questions are linked to your research brief as well, right? And so you should be able to link every single question that you're asking to a need that's expressed in your research brief. The questions should be focused. They should be neutral and non-leading. They shouldn't be biased. They should be plain spoken, so no jargon. And we tend to, for our adult populations, we aim for about an 8th grade reading level. That doesn't mean that we think that our populations read at an 8th grade reading level, but it means that it's going to be plain spoken enough for anybody to understand it so that you can get accurate data back. And it allows opting out. So you shouldn't have any forced responses in any of your questions, particularly sensitive questions where they can't advance to the next part of the survey if they don't answer it. The only reason you would use that kind of forced response is early in a survey if you're asking a not sensitive question that leads to other questions later. But generally, you don't allow opting out. You don't force responses.
Could I jump in with a question that's in the Q&A right now? Tim,
Yes.
you may want to answer this. It's about how you address parent concerns about student privacy and opting out options.
Yeah, I would lead with a similar theme to what I articulated before, which is essentially what we're trying to do is create a safe and trusting space in our schools, and so we want to use the same ethic when we're interacting with parents or any other constituent group there. So protecting people's privacy is important. Julia, do you want to expand on that?
And then you have to enact that in your survey design.
Yes.
So make sure then in your survey design, you are not using the forced response option, that you're giving people the ability to not answer a question. So whatever you say you're going to do, then that needs to be communicated to your team that's building the survey, because it needs to actually do that, right? And so in your invitation, if you're promising certain protections too, that needs to be communicated to your survey design team so that they can make sure that they're selecting all the relevant options in the survey tool.
Thank you.
So I have some examples of some survey questions so that we can kind of talk about. Hopefully you'll use chat for this part. But I wanted to talk about some actual survey questions and why they might not be optimal. And so if you could take a look at this question, I will pull up the chat. If you could just express your reaction to this question, whether you think that this is a good question, what you think might be going on with this one. Excellent. 2 questions in one. We call this double-barreled. Watch out for conjunctions, ands, buts, ors in your sentence. That will clue you in that you're asking more than one thing. If a parent were to, if this was going to a parent or a colleague and they disagreed with this or agreed with this, you don't know if they're agreeing with it because they're welcome to express their concerns or welcome to ask questions, or both. And those are very different levels of trust in your community. It's one thing to feel like you can ask a question. It's another thing to feel like you can express concerns. The ideal design for this would be one or the other. I feel welcome to express my concerns. I feel welcome to ask questions. And you'll get a better response. I've got another one for you. I believe we've probably all seen this one. Overall, I'm satisfied with my child's education. So good. I'm so glad you're picking up on a lot of things. So first of all, it's not actionable. We've asked this question in our own surveys. We have found that it's too broad. It's not actionable. When you get your responses back, there's really not a lot you can do about this one. And it's incorrect to think that as you improve experience, that ratings on this question would increase. That doesn't always happen for a lot of reasons, and is just not specific enough. It also misses the fact, someone's really clever in the chat here, it misses the fact that many parents that receive this survey have more than one child. And so who are you asking about? Are you asking about all of the children? Are you asking about a specific child? A parent doesn't know a lot of times how to answer this. The way this is framed, oh, go ahead, Tim, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I would just say that it's also episodic, meaning you're catching that person at a given moment, and we all know as school leaders that can flip-flop, and as educators that can flip really easily. So the overall thing, it points back to that word being difficult, loaded, somewhat biased, and not all that helpful.
Yeah, I think the worst thing about it is it's just not actionable, really.
Yeah.
Trillium.
Yeah, this might be a good time to ask this question that just came in from Hugh. Do you favor including a neutral option in your choices versus just having positive options? Do you have a neutral option? Like, I have no opinion, or I'm not exactly sure what that would look like.
It's part of allowing people to opt out. However, as a data analyst, you treat it as missing. You treat it as a non-response when you're actually looking at the distributions of responses. And so it's honestly not helpful. And I do know some survey designers do take it out to sort of force an opinion. But you're sacrificing some accuracy there because folks will just choose, and it won't be as it won't be as accurate. It's not worth the trade-off.
So you're saying to have a neutral option, but then disregard that part of the data?
When you're looking at the distribution, it's not that you disregard it, it's that you don't overinterpret that middle. If it's a 5-point scale, you don't overinterpret that middle bar. You really focus on agreement versus disagreement. Sometimes we'll even express our results in % agreement versus disagreement, and so, but you just want to make sure that that's a non-response. And then some folks in the chat were asking about whether it's leading. Well, I'll show you a leading question in a minute. This one in particular, because you're framing it positively and then you're leading with the strongly agree, I do think that that's a little bit leading as well. It's okay to give statements and ask for agreement to disagreement. That's a Likert type scale. Folks are very used to it, but you really are front loading the expectation that folks are satisfied too with this question. Here's a good one then. Perfect segue. What do you think about this question? That's right. The first question is priming a particular response. It's definitely leading. And as tempting as it can be, if you are specifically working on this, then you want to make sure that you don't lead with that. Not in your survey invitation, not in the question. And you should probably put in a few other questions around communication to sort of make sure that folks aren't focusing exclusively on what you had decided to work on. This is a very leading question. Here I'm going toward our employee, our colleagues. What do you think about this one?
Can you define OKR for those who haven't
That's
seen
the
it before?
point. This is jargon. This is jargon, and you should avoid it. Be plain spoken. If you were to be in a conversation, I don't know too many people who really throw around OKRs.
Yeah.
So something more like, my manager helps me set priorities. My manager helps me meet my goals would be less jargony and more plain spoken. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and critique this guy. Try not to ever have an always or a conditional in a survey because it's just too constrained, and then the response options don't really match. Okay, there's plenty other survey questions that are offenders of our rules. You will get better and better at spotting them as you start to review surveys that people are proposing at your organization or you're designing them yourself. The next part of the talk has to do with setting your data analytic plans. I know that this is a bit technical, but on our team, we do establish the data analytic strategy ahead of time using a memo. And so when you get this handout, you will be able to review this, but it does lay out the data source you'll be accessing in addition to the problems and the research questions from your research brief. It will repeat those. It has a place for you to talk about the data protections. How are they identifiable? What will you do to protect identity, where they're housed, how you're passing off data, where they live, and then the variables you're going to use in the analytic strategy. I like to have that up front so that after the analysis is done is not when I'm critiquing the methods, right? The deadlines and the roles, who's doing what on the project is incredibly helpful to have that laid out ahead of time. When you're doing your data analysis, you are actively working against bias. You're doing everything you can to present evidence in a neutral way that allows people to process and action plan around that evidence and mitigates the bias. There will be a list of biases in the handout that is part of this talk. But some of the ones that the big offenders are confirmation bias. If you've got a previous hypothesis in mind, whether you hold it or not, you're going to be looking for evidence that confirms that hypothesis. You will have the false belief that everybody thinks like you, And so these are things that you can review, but you're working hard as a data analyst to counteract those biases and give clear evidence for your leaders to work with. And we talked about these other aspects that are laid out in the memo. You really want to have those data protections in place, roles assigned, so you know who's doing what, and your process for checking after and quality assurance. When it comes to your reporting, less is more. It should be actionable. It should be clear and concise. There should not be 70, 80-page survey reports. There should be a 2 to 3 page report that summarizes the main findings for your leaders. Try to have it be as visual as you can have it, and try to make sure that sort of your use of color, the way you're expressing that visual, makes sense for your community. There could be an analysis of the open-ended comments in there, where you are reviewing all of the comments, you're coding them so you can figure out which ones are most frequent and in which direction they lean. If they're asking for adjustments or if they're giving positive feedback, you'll want to include an analysis of those comments, maybe a few actual comments to bring it to life. It should be turned around quickly. We strive for under 2 weeks from the close of the survey, and then it should be reported back to your survey respondents in the actions, and maybe not the actual report, but there should be a communication. Here's what we learned, and here's what we're doing about it. Again, that really helps build the trust. It helps build the participation later when they see the direct impact of the time that they spend on this survey. When it comes to visuals, I have found a visual on Tableau Public. This link will be available to you later. But I did want to sort of check in on a few things. We have one clear question. We have a nice set of response options that cover the majority of the responses that folks might have or anticipate. And we've got a nice design that shows the, what they consider to be essential versus unessential. And it really draws the eye to those, to the parts of their education that these respondents view as essential. I don't love the use of color. I think in a lot of cultures, the use of red has a specific meaning. So you would want to think about that. I like the gray on the negative side, but the color on the positive side is a bit weird to my eye. I think it might have to do with school colors. But think about color in your visualizations. Think about how quickly the insights jump off the page for your leaders. Think about minimizing the work that they have to do to get to the action planning through your visualization and through your concise and neat report. And with that, I'll pass it on to Tim to talk about discussion and action planning.
Thank you, Julia. That was a master course over the last 30 to 40 minutes from, again, someone who knows this domain extraordinarily well. And in speaking with Julia over the years, I've just learned that this is both an art and a science. It's great survey design, appropriate analysis, and then informing for action as well. There's so many subtle skills there along the line. And this is, getting her advice over the years about how best to do that has really helped us all in the organization and leaders of campuses to make meaning of this data and then to take action on it too. So I just wanted to reflect a little bit about as a leader of a campus or a division or a group, and you want to do a survey, then there are a few steps that you really want to engage in order to really maximize the impact of that. The first one is to engage. It's basically to do your homework. It's to spend some time, if it's at the survey design phase, spend some time thinking about the question that you want to answer, the type of approach that you want to take, and to really think carefully about whether a survey is the right tool. As you know, surveys are one of many data sources that we can gather in the school. We can directly speak to people. We can do focus groups. We can facilitate various other forms of data as well. We can talk about participation, retention, student performance from external exams, etc. There's a lot of data that we want to think about, and surveys are not always the answer, but sometimes they are. So do that thinking up front. If you've engaged in a survey, then be the first one really to try to interact with that data and do so with an open mind. Try to put your biases aside if you can, and try to delve into it. What the advice that Julie and I would give is that you enter into this with a spirit of inquiry, very similar to what you would try to espouse as a teacher of an inquiry-based classroom, where you're trying to live in the really good questions and then you're open to whatever answers you get. If you're presupposing a sort of answer and at the initial stage you have sort of a bias, it's really important to sort of face that down if you can, and confront it and say, look, if I'm going to do this, I need to be radically open to whatever I receive, and then spend the time coming to terms with that first as an individual, and then think about how you want to introduce it to your team and invite them to do likewise. So the next stage is to facilitate a discussion with your team. And Julie and I have hot links here to an engagement page here and to a facilitation protocol as well. So with your teams, she's got the engagement portion up there too. So what you're doing is again trying to dig in, to try to understand what you're looking at, to tap into your own feelings. How do I feel about this data, and how can I separate my own personal view for what the organization actually needs to hear, and then what are my thoughts about what the data is saying to us, and then perhaps most importantly, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to turn these into plans? If you don't have the intention to actually act on something, I would say don't do the survey to begin with, because the purpose of a survey is to inform behavior. It's to gather evidence and to help the organization to move forward, to help you to take action on something that's vital to the organization. And that's the reason you would do it. If the answer to those questions at the beginning is not, yeah, there is something I really need to find out, I want to be open to it, then pick a different route or spend your energy somewhere else, because it takes a lot of energy to do these things. The data protocol as well is a very important tool where you're sitting down with your team and trying to figure things out. Again, so you can see in that left-hand column there, you've done your homework, and then with a pre-group, with a group, you're sort of going through those key questions. You're sharing your understanding. You're looking at the most important elements. You're trying to follow up and follow through, and developing those plans to act on those things. And that can be really difficult. To each one of those stages can be difficult. Again, to be radically open to whatever the data is saying to you. But it's important at this stage for the leader to model those exact things. It's sort of saying to your teachers in their teacher training, if you're going to engage in inquiry, then you need to model inquiry. As a leader as well, if you're going to engage in inquiry into the organization through the use of surveys, you need to model that radical openness too. And that's where the courage and humility balance comes into play. It's you have to be courageous in order to be open to whatever people say to you. And then you also need to be humble enough to ask those questions and know that it may be an answer that's going to hurt or that's going to be difficult to hear for whatever reason. But that's the way we grow. And that's the way we can guide our organization to a healthier place. So to be a champion, not only of that process, but then to cultivate, that sense of community, of resolution, of collective engagement, to go after the plans that are attached to the data afterwards. That's the cycle of learning that we need to be committed to. So that's sort of our overview at this point, and I hope that you found that helpful. What we wanted to do now, Trillium, is to open it up for further questions. You've asked some great ones along the way here. I love this graphic. This is one of, I think you need to go back to the elephant maybe for a second.
You do have the best looking slides, you guys, I have to say. They're very nice.
It's all Julia, but
yeah, that's
it's time to get on board with the difficulties of good survey design here and the action that follows it. So thank you for that.
We do have a designer who I've learned from, but is the master of our slides.
Well, who knew that survey design could be so much fun? And also, I never thought I would hear the quote like I did earlier. I love the GDPR. I don't think I've ever heard anyone else say those words, Julia. So thank you for that. We have so many questions coming in the Q&A, but also we had some good questions that came in ahead of time with the registration. So I'd like to ask a few if you don't mind. Let's start with talking about younger students. We have a lot of questions with our NEASC survey too. What age should you start using surveys with students? And what's the best way to go about doing that?
We don't survey students who are under about 9 or 10 years of age. We would prefer other research methods for the younger kids, such as one-on-one conversations, group discussions in class. But to be able to reflect on one's own perceptions and give that back accurately in a survey does seem to require a little bit more maturity. And we also recommend, we've got some lesson planning for teachers around giving surveys, even for our 9 and 10 and 11 and 12-year-olds. That's a skill, and you need to approach it like you're teaching a skill. But the very young students, I think you need to look for other research methods besides a survey.
And when getting students involved in general, do you recommend that schools set aside time during the school day when all students are doing the survey, for example? Or are there other tips like, having the survey available when parents are in the school for parent-teacher conferences to get participation? Any other ideas that you can suggest to get higher participation rates?
Those are both great ideas. I've never had more success than when a leader carves out time during the day to devote to the survey, or during an experience like a parent event to carve out time for them to sit and do it, because you're facilitating it and you're saying your time is valuable. And we acknowledge that. And so we want to do this together at a specific time. That's the best strategy that I've seen for getting the participation up.
And what about bribing students, for example, with, donuts and things like that? Does that work?
Not okay. Nope. Nope. No. Ice
May
cream
influence
parties.
The outcomes a little bit.
It does. Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I think celebrating the participation and saying, wow, we're doing great. We've got 80% participation. We want to get more, kind of rallying and cheering. That's fine, but no bribes.
And how many reminders do you recommend sending out about a survey?
We do 2 reminders. So we do the initial invitation, a gentle reminder, and then the last call. don't be surprised if it's the last call that gets a lot of about 30% of those responses in, but we don't remind more than that. We've found that excessive reminders it'll plateau the number of responses you get back.
There's a fine line with badgering.
Agreed.
And just, those are messages that are coming across email most often, and we need to be judicious with that.
Great tips. What do you suggest schools do with all of the qualitative data that they collect? How do they analyze that, especially if they have open-ended questions on their surveys, for example, especially if some of that comes in multiple languages? Any ideas on that?
So we have developed an approach to that. So your goal with analyzing qualitative data like comments, your goal is to extract the big themes out of those data and to make actionable suggestions. So if that's your goal, then what we do is we read all of the comments and we code it with the theme as well as the direction, if it's more adjusting, asking for an adjustment, or if it's giving positive feedback. That way we report on the themes that have the highest frequency, and we're able to describe, then go back to those comments and describe in a narrative what the folks are saying, provide a couple of examples. That is labor intensive, but it is so fruitful, and you can even sort of train some folks who aren't in data analytics to do that with you. And it can help them get into the data, but your goal is to produce that succinct summary and avoid bias.
Yeah.
You don't want to just dump the comments on a leader, because what will happen sometimes is that they'll read, it'll be overwhelming, and then the first comment that resonates with a previously held belief is the explanation that folks will gravitate to, because we've got to cut through complexity and get to simplicity, and that's what they're working to do. So you must analyze those comments and provide that to your leaders.
Do you recommend any particular? Sorry, Tim. Just wondering if you use or recommend any particular tools for coding that yourself, if there are any tools that you recommend.
I don't recommend word clouds, I'll tell you that. Unless you've asked the question, like, what's the most common word that you would describe to, about your science class or something. Now a word cloud makes sense. There's just no quick way to do that work. You need to have 2 to 3 dedicated folks who are going to code those comments and create those summaries and send them back out. But I can tell you that it is incredibly fruitful to do that, because we're trying to listen. If you've got a survey that's built with majority rating questions, and that's not actually listening, that's you talking and then getting a response back on each rating question, you're not really listening until you get to the open-ended, and you're allowing folks to say, okay, I answered your questions, here's what's on my mind. So it's fruitful, and then to be able to bring in a few choice quotes that kind of summarize that theme really brings it to life. So it's worth doing.
I was just going to say that on the receiving end of those notes, those condensations of all that hard work, it's incredibly valuable, because it cuts right to the quick, and it helps us to navigate our biases too. It's basically a third party has done the analysis up front, coded that mound of data. It's less overwhelming, and it really cuts right to the elements that you're going to need in order to take action from there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There are some software I saw in the comments. Somebody mentioned In Vivo. Somebody else mentioned Deduce. We just use a spreadsheet, and that works just fine for us, because the effort is still going to be there. If you're using these qualitative software, you're still going to be coding those comments. You're still going to be developing your code book. You're still going to be doing all that. We just use a spreadsheet. So.
That's so funny. We just had a comment in the chat. The answer is always a spreadsheet.
Oh, and we do translate the comments prior to coding as well. So if you get responses back in the target language, you must first translate them.
Great. Unfortunately, our time is starting to wane here, but I'd like to ask one more question if you don't mind, and we may go 5 minutes over if that's all right with everyone. If you
Certainly.
can't continue to stay with us, we understand. But I'd like to ask, several people have asked something similar about how to pace out survey questions or different research questions throughout the year and some sort of a calendar to avoid overload, survey fatigue.
Mm. That's a great question. I think doing your best to map that. There's sometimes some episodic, reasons to go off schedule there, but to at least map that at the beginning as to know the times when you're going to do it. That's very helpful. And then to be in a cadence where you're gathering data for a particular reason to inform, it's the action for the next phase of your development that school year. And just to speak to that, the amount of energy that it takes to do this is really so important to think about too. So quickly, we put out the quick survey without thinking about what the appropriate analysis, dissemination of information, the action planning, all that sort of thing that we've been talking about here. If you're not prepared to put in all that energy to it and to act on the elements that you've learned, then don't do it. It's not a good use of your time unless you're going to do it justice from start to finish.
I would agree. It's all too easy to pull together a survey in the survey software that's available, whether you're using Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or Google Forms. It's so easy to do that it's very misleading. The effort's tremendous to pull together a good survey, to design it, to engage your community. And so we do have a policy where surveys need to be approved. And it's not meant to be shut people down, stop people from being curious, stop people from collecting data. It's just so that we don't just pile survey upon survey, because what happens is everybody's participation goes down. And you won't get participation in your organizational surveys, and folks who are doing their own surveys won't get participation either, because they're just exhausting our people. So
one of the things we struggle with in schools is sort of the tyranny of the urgent, and there's a lot of urgent in schools, particularly these days, and the complexity is sort of mounting as well. And often, survey is sort of the knee jerk, and we need to resist that and say, look, let's make a thoughtful decision about how we want to find out what's actually happening here and to navigate the next steps forward. And it could be that, other forms of information gathering, data gathering, what have you, is going to be far superior to this one.
So hopefully not over 100 people are going to call and try to hire Julia away from you, Tim, because I'm sure they're all thinking, but we don't have a Julia at our school. That's the problem. So I'll give you one last prompt, if you don't mind. If you don't have a Julia who understands this in your school, what's the first step you would take in doing something small in survey giving or receiving in the school? So one, maybe, is it the pulse surveys, something short and sweet? How would you get started if you're not doing any of this yet?
Julie, I'm going to dish that to you.
Okay, there are validated surveys out there, so that would be a good place to start. So if you're interested in a particular research question, get onto Google Scholar and look and see if folks have developed surveys on that question. There are groups that are out there that will share their surveys. I know NEASC has some surveys you can use. Try to use the pre-validated surveys that are out there, and then critique each question though. If you see a double-barreled question, edit it. If you want to keep to 12 or 14 survey questions, vet the most important and only include those. So you can still work on it afterward. But that would be a great place to start.
Great answer. Tim, do you have anything more to add, or was that her answer just too perfect? So you're gonna leave it at that?
That was a mic drop.
I thought so. This has been so helpful, you both. I mean, I know for myself, I'm over here taking notes for myself while you're doing this session as well, and I'm sure others are too. I really hope that, I hope that all the tools that you're sending will be helpful for people. And, I'm just going to thank you once again for giving of your time and thinking so well through our audience and what they needed to hear. Now it's just lovely to see the amazing global reach that this forum has had. And we thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Julia and Tim, again, from everyone at NEASC. Great partners in thought. Thank you.